trying to change God's word to fit their needs. And people must understand, God's done his part. It's our turn. Okay? We need to do what we need to do. And then the last verse there, when he comes, our glorious King. Christ is coming back. Christ is coming back. And man, if we ain't ready, it's going to be an awfulest day. Yeah, I need one. Need all the help I can get. But it's just so amazing to me. And I'm not talking about people out in the world who are doing things that are not even connected to any religious organization or knows nothing about Scripture or Bible and have no desire to learn. I'm talking about those who say they do know and won't follow what he says. And I remember a sermon one time that was taught, and it was very clear, the Scriptures and what they were saying. And the first half of the sermon, almost everybody agreed with it. And the second half, probably half agreed with it, because it began to step on their toes. And I like Brother Floyd's philosophy, we don't go along to get along. It's either God's way or you're not going to heaven. And so as we sang that song, it brought about a lot of memories, a lot of thoughts about Christ dying and finishing his course, what he came to do, and he's coming back. Man, we need to be ready, don't we? Need to be ready. We'll be in Ecclesiastes Chapter 7 this morning. There's some verses in here, some sayings and things that are kind of difficult to understand in some ways. And in my studies, I come to a conclusion on my own what I thought they meant. But as I studied other people's words on it and teachings, that I'm not 100% sure I'm right. So if I teach anything here this morning and someone in here knows I'm wrong, then please point it out to me. I will not be angry. I will thank you from the bottom of my heart if I teach anything wrong and I'm corrected for it. That'd be great. So the first 6 chapters of Ecclesiastes is talked about the vanity. If we go all the way back to chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, in the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities. And even in verse 3, what profit hath the man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? He's setting the stage there for 6 chapters of, if you put your trust in this, then it's vanity. It's not going to help you any. You put your trust, and we had a list on the board one day about managing your businesses, the work you do, the wealth you manage, and everything that we do in life. The ultimate result is if God is not in front and our leader, all we do is vanity. And why is that? Because we all end up in the same place, right? If you're a multi-billionaire or you're a pauper on the street, there's a day coming when you will die. It's appointed on the man wants to die. So life is vanity if we don't have God in our life, and God being the source of our strength, and we depend on him. And so in the course of our studies, in chapter 3 and verse 1, to everything there is a season and a time, and every purpose under the heaven. The writer, the preacher here, he's saying, listen, there's a time for everything to happen. And he goes on to tell all these things, and we can't change them. We can't change them. And so in chapter 6 and verse 12, who knoweth what is good for a man in this life? All the days of his vain life which he spendeth as a shadow, for who can tell a man what shall be after him under the sun? So we have been instructed in these first 6 chapters that we got to be careful about putting our trust in something other than God. whether it be wealth or fame, or we want attention, power, whatever it might be. We studied, it doesn't matter how high up the totem pole you are under the sun, there's still one higher, right? There's still somebody to answer to. So again, the most powerful to the weakest is the same as from the most wealthiest to the poorest, all going to end up in the same place. We're all going to the ground. We're all going to die. And so what we need to set our sights on then is enjoying this life. And the preacher has told us in a couple of different places in the first 6 chapters that we can have wealth and enjoy it. And we can enjoy our life here on earth. We don't have to. God's not the enemy. God didn't write this book just so he could go around and say, now Brent messed up, wham, hit him over the head with a hammer. No, he's telling us the right way to live for our benefit. That's what it's about. God's not the enemy, as many in our society today would like for people to believe. He is not the enemy. And so when he tells us something, we go, well, I don't want to do that. Well, you may not want to, but for your eternal salvation, you better listen to what God's saying, because everything else is vanity. If you want to do it your way, it's a waste of time. It's vanity. And so we've learned that in 6 chapters. Now here in chapter 7, as we begin, there's going to be some proverbs, if you will, like in the first 14 verses maybe, and they're going to be instructing us on some things that we probably don't really look at it like the writer here looks at it in our everyday life in some of these things. But he's going to instruct us which is better for us. And the word better is used 8 times in the first 10 verses. So we're going to listen to what he has to say. Wisdom, I think, is used like 31 times in chapter 7. And so we need to pay attention to what the preacher's telling us here. An inspired writer of the Holy Scriptures is telling us some very important things for you and I to know and how to approach our life and enjoy it. We don't have to, it's not, again, we can enjoy life because we can put things in their proper place in this life under the sun. And if we keep them in the proper place, in the proper order, man, we can really enjoy this life. And we can really have a good hope of heaven. So it's some pretty good instructions, even though it maybe not exactly like you and I would think of it on a daily basis. Chapter 7, verse 1. A good name is better than a precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. A good name is better. There's that word better. It's better to be respected and to do right and to do good than it is to have a precious ointment or to have wealth. The precious ointment here is a sense of wealth, a representation of wealth. Which would you rather have? Would you rather be earthly rich and people all the time question your honesty and your integrity and the things you do and being dishonest and deceitful in gaining all these wealth and riches? Or would you rather just have a good name? And that's kind of what he's saying here. You know, I want, if you're going to live a Christian life, you would rather, I'm talking about Christians under the sun, living for God with your priorities right, and you're living a Christian life, wouldn't you rather have just enough to get by on, be content, and set an example for others than to have wealth and people think of you as being deceitful, a liar, a thief, and I mean, so which is the best? Which is the best? And I guess that's the way the writer wants us to look at it. What's better for us under the sun? Now, we already studied, remember the things we studied in the first 6 chapters about the vanities. So here is a direction that a good name is better than precious ointment, or a good name is better than wealth, better than riches. And so we need to understand just living a Christian life is good enough, right? It's good enough. And we don't need, I'm not saying it's wrong to have wealth. I'm not saying that at all. But it's wrong to put your wealth ahead of your good name. So we must strive to do things God's way. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Have you ever just sat down and pondered on that? Let's just say you've never read the Bible, you've never been anywhere to study the Bible, but one day you just sit down and go, you know, it'd be better if I was dead than alive. You ever hear anybody say that? You know? Why? Why would you say that? I mean, that's pretty cold-hearted. That's a challenge to God. And I'm talking about people under the sun without any hope of going to heaven. But why would it be better to die outside the Lord without any hope than to live? I mean, that's, again, we're back to people who don't understand what God is trying to do for us, for the people under the sun. But let's look at it this way. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. The day of death, physical death, under the sun, is better for a righteous person than to live in this messy world, right? Isn't that what Apostle Paul said? Isn't that what he said? Better for me to be with Christ? Better to die and go on? Far better, that's right. Let's go to Job chapter 14. I think this is a important verse for all of mankind to understand. If we go along with understand why it's better, the day of death is better than the day we were born. In Job chapter 14, verse 1, man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. Okay, now we studied in chapter 6 about the possibility, an exaggeration of the preacher's writing, about a man living 1,000 years twice told, 2,000 years, has hundreds of kids. What's better than that? A stillbirth? Why? Because no matter how long you live, it doesn't matter how long you live. If you're not living right, the end result is going to be catastrophic. You're going to end up in a place where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, where the fire is not quenched and the worm dieth not. So in Job chapter 14, verse 1, we can understand that our life will not be long. What about trouble? Will there be any troubles in this life, even for Christians? Is there troubles in this life for all people? Remember what we studied in chapter 3. A time for this, a time for that. All those things are going to happen to everybody. It doesn't matter if you're living right or wrong. Right? It's going to happen. And you can't change it. I don't care, you can't. Just can't change it. And so when we understand the day of death is better than one's birth, we don't have to face all the troubles and turmoils no more if we're righteous when we die. It's pointed on the men once to die, and after this, the judgment. How would you want to face judgment? How would you want to face that? Prepared or unprepared? There's no third choice. There's no third choice. Heard many people say, well, you're just too strict in your teaching, or you are teaching something that's not true. Now, if you're teaching a false doctrine, better go to the Bible and find out what's going on. But if the truth is being taught, and you witness, or you're not witness, but if you teach others on a one-on-one basis at work, in the restaurant, wherever you're at with them, wherever you run into somebody that you have opportunity to teach, and they won't accept the teachings of Christ, because you're not teaching what you believe, right? You're teaching what you believe, but you're not teaching who wrote it. I mean, you're not the one who made up the rules. God made up the book that we go by, and that's what we are to teach. And that's all. And if you're doing that and people reject it, whose fault is it? So here, when we talk about the day of death and the day of one's birth, we celebrate birthdays. We really, when my kids were growing up, we had a birthday party for each one of them every year. Sandy would fix them a cake, and I'd eat it. But 4 kids, they should have got some of it. But, we did that. How many times you have a celebration for the day of one's death? Because we don't think that way, do we? We don't think that way. But looking forward to heaven is, you don't want to miss it. You just don't. Brother Floyd.
That's not a statement, though, that applies to everyone.
And what do you mean? The day of death is not better for everyone? Right.
That does not necessarily apply to everyone, and also there's one thing that you don't want to get out of that. That is, don't rush it.
Right.
Do it yourself. It's not one of those do-it-yourself projects that, in other words, I'm talking about people that end their own life. That to me applies to a minority.
Yeah. Well, there's if you die, no matter how you die, if you die lost, it doesn't matter when or how. If you die lost, they're just, it wouldn't be better. The day of death wouldn't be better, right? Yeah, it would not be better than the day of one's birth. But here's the thing I think that the writer, the preacher here is trying to tell us. If you've got a good name, and that to me is suggesting that you're doing right.
Right. All the things down through there tie together.
Right.
In other words, what applies to one applies to the next, right on down through that.
Exactly. Down through this chapter, right. That's right. And so I think what he's saying here, if you're doing the right thing, it's better, the day of your death is better than the day you were born. Is that right? I appreciate that you pointing that out. That's good. That's a good thought. Because as long as you got life and your mind's good, you got a chance to get things right? But whose job is it to make sure that somebody hears it that don't want to hear? It's our job, So.
You used there a while ago, unprepared.
Yeah.
That's a good word to use there.
Yeah.
We always want to be prepared. Even though today's not our death, if we're prepared for it,
Right.
we're all right. We're
Good to go.
good to go. Yeah. Yeah,
It's a good way to say it. We're good to go. I think I think there's one thing that we as a people, as a Christian people, and I'm talking about Christian people, that we have a difficult time with, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but is the waiting for the reward. I think there's so many people that come to the knowledge of the truth, and they obey the gospel, and they live it for a while, and nothing changes, and they walk away. And I think why they walk away is 2 things. One thing, they don't believe, and their faith is not strong enough to keep them. That's one thing. But another thing is, we're not a patient people. And I'm just talking about people in general now, not the Christian people. Christian people better be patient. Okay? But we want things now. How many times have you prayed and asked God for something and then went and tried to fix it yourself. You know, just like, I'm not waiting on God to take care of this. I'm going to do it myself. God doesn't work on your time or my time. Now, we sang that song a while ago about the Lord coming back. He's coming back. Jesus is coming back. Now, when's he coming back? I don't know. And you don't know either. So why don't I just go do anything I want under the sun and have a good time, because there's pleasure in sin for a season, right? And so why don't I do all that till I see him coming, and then I'll fix things? Huh? Too late. And another thing, what about the good name here? If you're going to live a wild life, who are you going to help come to the knowledge of the truth? So we got reasons to live Christian lives. Are we patiently waiting on the promises of God as Christians? We should be. We better be. Well, they may not come for another 1,000 years. Don't matter. Doesn't matter how long it is. Doesn't matter. God will keep his promises. Again, God's not on our time schedule. In fact, God don't need time. He made that for me and you. Okay? So when we talk about the day of death and the day of one's birth, a better name is better than wealth. We can relate to each of those. And a good thing Floyd pointed that out. The day of death is not a good day for those who are lost or unprepared. And so,
A lot of times, the only Bible that people see is the way we live our lives.
yeah.
And our goal should be that on the day of our death, that nobody mourns.
Yeah, everybody be happy. It would be it's so much easier for me, okay, to attend a funeral visitation or a funeral itself with someone that I feel confident died saved than it is someone that, gosh, I don't know. You know, I don't think they made it. That's hard. There was a guy I worked with, his mom died, and they had the funeral at South Shore. I went to the funeral, and a young man I worked with, a couple of days after the funeral, when he come back to work, he asked me, he said, do you think the preacher done a good job of preaching Mom's funeral? And I said, if you want me to answer that truthfully, and he said, yes. And I said, no, he did not. He done a very poor job. And he said, what did he do that you would have done different? I said, I would have preached the Bible, and I wouldn't have preached my feelings. And he preached his feelings, and he made you all feel good. And you all came away from there with no idea or no thought of changing the way you live. And I said, he done, in my opinion, he done a poor job. But I said, I'll say this, from what you've told me, he didn't know your mom. He didn't know her at all. And he said, no, he didn't. He said, we just called somebody and asked them if they'd preach it. But that's how far people get away from God. They don't even know a preacher well enough to ask them to come and preach a funeral. And it's difficult to preach a funeral if you don't know the person. You know, I've done that a couple of times, and it's difficult. But a preacher needs to preach the truth, whether it's at a funeral or whether it's here in the building, or it's like Tom said, if it's out there in the world where people only see your sermon the way you live. And that's it. There's ways to teach. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to their heart. Okay, I think what he's saying here is it's better for you to go to the funeral home than it is to go to a party. I just talked about having parties for my kids' birthday parties. But it's better. And there's another thing. This is just a personal thing with me, so maybe I'm stepping out of line here a little bit. I think we should take our children to funeral homes. I hear a lot of people today, I don't want to traumatize my kids. I'm going to leave them with grandpa and grandma while I go to the funeral. Or what. You take those kids to a funeral home. They need to see death. It's not going to traumatize them. It's a natural, death is as natural as the sun coming up. It's not a shock to society that somebody dies. And it's not a shock to those kids. They can handle it. God fixed it where they can handle it. But if you keep shunning them away from it, they'll never be afraid of death. They'll have no reason to be afraid. And so when you go to talking to them about death and telling them about God and what's going to happen, they ain't going to believe you. They've never seen it. I think we need to take our children to the funeral homes. And here he's saying, this is the end of all men. This is where it's going to end at, right? Under the sun. This is where it's going to end, under the sun. So why is it? Well, the living will lay it to his heart. At a funeral visitation one time, and the daughter of the person who had died was standing there and said, I'm going to miss my dad. I'm going to miss him. And said, people come up to me and tell me that he's better off where he's at than the way he was suffering and stuff. And she said, but I still want him here. And that's as natural as you can get, right? The love of a child for their parents. I mean, what's greater than that? But the message was taught. There is a heaven and there is a hell. And at the funeral home, this person knew that before they left that funeral home. So the living understand death. If you're alive on this earth and you see death, you understand that, well, it's not my day today, but and maybe it is. You know, maybe I won't make it till dark tonight. Who knows? Who knows? But be good to go, right? So when we're going to a house of mourning, and I've always wondered this, and maybe you all have an answer, but this verse kind of reflects the way we handle funerals today. When someone passes, after it's all over, we all get together and have a meal. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I never really thought about it till I read this verse about, you know what I mean? Do we have the meal, a feast, to forget the sorrow and the sadness? I mean, that's part of it. It's a healing process, right? I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But I've seen funerals that are sad, a lot of crying, a lot of teaching of the Bible, a lot of praying, singing, a lot of tears. And then when you go to the meal after, it's laughter and joy. And I remember this, we as a congregation, several of us went to a gospel meeting somewhere one time. And I'm not going to mention names or where it was at or anything. But this guy preached a great sermon, the man who preached that night. He'd done a wonderful job in teaching the Bible. And at the end of the service, he started talking about things of the world. Now, I don't know about you all, but generally speaking for me, the last thing I hear is what I remember the most. Okay? So, after hearing a real good sermon, and then for 20 minutes or 15 or 20 minutes after that sermon ended, this guy turned into an entertainer. And everybody left laughing. And what would you remember about the sermon? I didn't remember much. I remember the entertainment, but I couldn't tell you what he preached on that night right now. So we've got to be careful, I think. And when we go to the house of mourning, The living will lay it to his heart. Once you see this death, and you're in a house of mourning, whether it's your family member or whether it's a friend, a brother or sister in Christ, or you're just doing a good deed or whatever it might be, when you're there and you leave, whether you go have a meal with the family or whatever, don't forget how you felt about the death when you seen the death. Because one of these days, if things go normal, like we're understanding they do, somebody's going to be looking down on you in that casket. It's going to be your turn one of these days. And I think that's what's being said here. When you go to the house of mourning, you better realize this may not be your day to be in that box, but your day's coming. And it may be closer than you think. We don't know, right? So it's better to go to the house of mourning than it is to the house of feasting. Brother Floyd?
Yeah, that passage reminds me and causes me to think about 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, and actually verse 13 and following.
Yeah.
What it says there, but I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. There's none who believe in Jesus. But the main thing is, it says, if we are brethren in Christ, in other words, we have hope.
Right.
Those who are outside of Christ are without hope. Is that what that's telling me?
Yeah.
If I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it's saying. And I love the way 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 18 ends the chapter.
But we won't have the sorrow that the world has. Yes, I have sorrow when someone I'm close to departs this earth. But most of it is I don't know if this is the right way to put it or not, but most of it is a personal sorrow. Because I'm going to miss them because I don't have them anymore as a
Right.
friend or whatever on this earth. But as far as the hope for them, 1 Thessalonians 4 explains that pretty well.
Yeah.
If they're a good friend and a Christian, and they should be both if they're one, but then
Right.
we don't sorrow like the rest of the world.
Right. Because a Christian has the same hope of the one that prepared for that day. And we understand that hope. And I think you can even reflect that back to chapter 7, verse 2 there about going to the house of mourning. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And chapter 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 18, he's talking about when the Lord will come back and all will go to meet him in the air and all that. And he ends the chapter with these words, "Wherefore comfort one another with these words." What would be more comforting than that? Isn't that a great thought? Comfort one another. Why? Because we're going to heaven together. We're going to heaven together. Man, ain't that great?
When those verses are taught, I think we should teach that the word hope means waiting on a promise.
Yeah.
I've been several times, well, 2 or 3 occasions I can think of, where I was trying to tell people about the gospel. They say, well, all you Christians is God is hope. Well, that's not like, oh, I hope I win the lottery, or I hope it don't rain tomorrow, or whatever. It's not hope like that.
No.
It's hope waiting on a promise. And
Hope,
from God.
the hope is an expectation. And I've used this example before. I used to get a paycheck every Thursday. But on some Mondays, I needed some money. So I wished Monday was payday. But when Thursday comes, I hope my check's in the mailbox. I expect it to be there. On Monday, when I made a wish, I never expected it to be there. It was just a wish. But when you say you hope for something, you have an expectation. And that's the way with God's promises. When you hope for this eternal life, you're expecting God to keep his promise. That's an expectation from you because of your faith.
They
Right. I think it's in Peter, 1 Peter maybe. Maybe you guys know where it's at. But it talks about when your faith ends. Can't remember exactly where it's at. But when I first read that, yeah, here it is, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 9. Receiving the end of your faith, even the salvation of your souls. What's he saying there? My faith's going to end when I see it, right? When I receive the promise, because then I can see it. It's not something I hope for with evidence of things not seen, because then I see it. And when I first read that my faith would end, I don't ever want my faith to end. But then when I studied it, and I see what he's telling us. So my hope is because of my faith, and you can't separate them. You're exactly right. Yeah.
These three where it talks about
Yep.
faith, hope, and charity or love.
Right.
And the only one of them is going to abide. Because what you hope for,
Yep.
you don't hope for it anymore if you have it.
Right. That's right. Richard?
I think one of the keys to this verse 2 here in Ecclesiastes 7 is the last phrase. The living shall lay it to his heart. When we go to the funeral home, what are we thinking about? We're considering the death of the individual, and it makes us realize that we're going to be there too.
Yep.
When we go to the house of feasting, are we thinking anything like that?
No.
We aren't considering anything like that, and in that situation, if we're not considering our ultimate end, then that could affect our behavior.
Yep.
The things that we do or think, whereas when we go to the house of mourning, then we reflect on that and remember that we are mourning.
Right.
And there's a couple of places our destination.
Yep. And we have a choice.
We will lay it to our heart,
Yep.
as it says.
That's right. Good point. Excellent. Well, we're about out of time. I thought we'd get further than that, but I guess I've been rattling too much. There's some really, really good teachings here in these next several verses. Sorrow is better than laughter. Well, that just sounds opposite the way we think. That's kind of going back to what Richard just said, right? We'd rather be at the feast and partying and laughing than to think about the house of mourning. So that's some things to think about too. I think this is, I wish I could teach Ecclesiastes the way it needs to be taught. I hope you all are. I appreciate y'all's patience. But there's just so much in here. We could spend a year on this. And we could, man, it just fits everybody's everyday life. Everybody. In any generation. And I think that is amazing within itself. Okay, we'll quit right there and pick up next week with verse 3, unless someone has some comments or more to say about what we've already taught. Thank you all very much.